It would be the ultimate insult and humiliation of China if Canada started or led a boycott of the 2022 Olympics in Beijing, should Canada start that parade. Hello and welcome to Unpublished TV. I'm Ed Hand. We're coming to you from a remote location and practicing physical distancing to enhance safety. We are less than a year away from the 2022 Winter Games, and there's a number of issues at play here, which gives us a more tangled view of the Olympics. The two Michaels, Spavor and Kovrig, have been held in a Chinese prison for 2 years awaiting trial on espionage charges. Observers point out that their incarceration was retroactive to the arrest of Huawei exec Meng Wanzhou for extradition to the U.S. While the two Michaels are in prison, Wanzhou is comfortable under house arrest. This isn't the only issue with China. It has been claiming islands in the South China Sea as its own and building them into military bases. There's a crackdown on freedoms in Hong Kong, threats against Taiwan, and the accusations of genocide against Uyghur Muslims. The Canadian Olympic Committee rejects the idea of a boycott, saying it doesn't work. It was invited to take part in the show, but declined. I invited the Chinese ambassador to Canada to join us today, but as I have several times before, did not receive a response. Now, you have to feel for the athletes in this situation. They have spent the last 4 years training for the games. Our unpublished.vote question asked, considering China's treatment of Canada, do you support a boycott of the 2022 games in Beijing? 90.8% said yes, 7.7% no, and 1.5% said unsure. Now, this is unscientific. It's a reflection of our viewers and followers. Now, however you're watching and listening to our show, whether through our social media channels on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, or our podcast channels, iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and more, I'd like to remind you, you can cast your vote on this topic at unpublished.vote and then email your MP to tell them why. Now, joining us to discuss the possibility of a boycott is Kevin Kai, Associate Professor, East Asian Studies at Renison College at the University of Waterloo. Ivy Lee is with the Canadian Friends of Hong Kong. Margaret McQuaig Johnson, Distinguished Fellow at the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. Alan Freeman, Senior Fellow at the University of Ottawa Graduate School of Public and International Affairs, along with a columnist with iPolitics. Now, it appears overwhelmingly our followers feel a boycott is in order, and we'll go around the around the horn. And Kevin, are you surprised that about 90% feel that Canada should back out?
Yes and no. Yes, because it's true that over the past 2 years, the relations between the two countries have been deteriorating because of mutual detention of the citizens of each other. So there was a lot of misunderstanding on the Canadian side, but as well on the Chinese side as well.
Mm-hmm. What do you think, Alan? You surprised that it's that high, or?
No, not really. I mean, the status or standing of China in public opinion is at its lowest level, I think, in probably recorded recent history. So there's no love lost, and it's not just the arbitrary detention of the two Michaels. It's as you're saying, it's the Uyghurs. It's destruction of any democratic institutions in Hong Kong, etc. What's interesting is that when it comes to the actual, whether it's a boycott or a transfer, I think there will be Canadians who are upset because for the Olympic athletes of what's going to happen to them, all the work they've done, will it go for naught? And obviously it's a big deal for a lot of people to watch the Olympics, particularly the Winter Olympics. Now, that's one of the things I think it's really important about this, and how Canada has a very important role. Summer Olympics is Canada's not a huge player, but in Winter Olympics, it's a much smaller pool. We were the number 3 in the number of medals. So we have a big role to play in the Olympics, whether they go on or not. So I think that's an important thing to think of in this.
Oh, okay. Ivy, you surprised that over 90% of our viewers, listeners feel that Canada should boycott?
No, I'm not surprised at all. It is actually very logical. Consistent with previous polls that Canadians have a low opinion on China. And I wanted to respond to the point about ethnics will be like victimized if we do anything, boycott or whatever. And we want to boycott Beijing. We don't need to boycott the Olympics. That's why we have a perfect solution, which is to move it out of Beijing. In that way, the ethnic can compete. They don't have to compete in Beijing. So just because IOC made a terrible decision several years ago, two wrongs don't make a right, and it's better late than never. And the rest of the world don't have to swallow the consequence of IOC's bad decisions, and we don't need to continue down an immoral path. And like the previous two guests mentioned about, that the genocide in Xinjiang on the Uyghurs, all the other gross human rights violations, including in Tibet, and to other rights and Chinese people too. So it is, I think, unconscionable to actually for us to go to Beijing. And then another thing I think is very interesting that seems no one has pointed out is from a sovereignty point of view, the COC right now is training our Olympians how to self-censor before they even go to Beijing. And of course, they have to self-censor there. So essentially, the freedom of speech and expression of our ethnics, the Olympic staff and the attendees are blatantly curtailed on Canadian soil by a foreign power. And then another, from a national point of view, allowing an Olympians going to Beijing is forcing them to become the Chinese Communist Party's propaganda tool. It is whitewashing their bloody genocide and human rights violations, and we strengthen their grip on the Chinese people, and we encourage them, their aggressive behavior to Canada and our allies. So why do we want to do that?
All right, good point, Ivy. If we'll get to Margaret next, and Margaret, 90% saying, at least our viewers, listeners, say Canada should boycott. Those numbers surprise you or no?
No, I think, a lot of really good points have been made already. And I really can't see the image of Canadian athletes and the Canadian flag marching into the Olympic Stadium while Michael Kovrig is in a prison cell somewhere in the city. And of course, the genocide against the Uyghurs is horrific. But the other people who would like to not see Canada attend are the Chinese, to the extent that they would get more medals. We won 29 medals at the last Olympics and 26 and 25 at the Winter Olympics before that. And they only won 9 in one case and 11 in another case. So there'd be a lot more medals that they could be getting. Whatever we do, though, I think we should be doing with other countries, whether it's a boycott or other measures. We talked about moving it, but I don't see any city or country stepping up to host. And it's less than a year in advance. And in a context of a pandemic, which makes it even more complicated to organize. So one of the things I've been suggesting is that we not have our athletes attend the opening and closing ceremonies. That's the big party where China gets to shine. And so I think if they just go and focus on the sports, that would be a much better way of representing Canada. And I think we could get at least a dozen other countries to go along with that.
All right. Now, Kevin, the Olympic Committee in every country makes the decision on whether a boycott is going to happen or not for that country. I found that interesting that it wouldn't be the government. Is that supposed to keep politics out of the situation like this?
In theory, everyone is saying that politics should be away from sports, but in reality, that is not the case. So as a matter of fact, politics and sports are always mingled with each other. And on this very case of whether Beijing Olympics of next year shall be boycotted or not, the call for boycott primarily comes from international human rights groups, and their call for boycott of Olympics in Beijing next year is primarily based on the accusation of so quote and the genocide in Xinjiang conducted by the Chinese government. This is really a serious accusation, and if it proves to be true, then it makes sense that boycott shall be pursued. But however, whether there is really a genocide in Xinjiang or not, there is still no conclusion. So far, and with exception of the United States, no other governments officially accuses China of genocide in Xinjiang. And in the case of US, it was on the eve of Biden coming into office. That is 1 day before Biden came into office. And the US Secretary of State, Pompeo, finally declared or announced or accused China of genocide in Xinjiang. And then after Biden administration came into office, the new administration continued to support this accusation. But however, 3 days ago, in Foreign Policy, there was an article, exclusive article. I've just got that. I just quote. Title of the article is, quote, State Department lawyers concluded insufficient evidence to prove genocide in China, quote. That was the article published 3 days ago. So for a genocide to have happened or not, it's really a legal issue. It should be based on hard evidence, very solid evidence. So far, it seems that Pompeo accused China of genocide, and the new government continue to endorse this accusation, not followed by other governments. It seems more like a political accusation, and not really based on sufficient evidence. So if we really want to, prove that this is a real genocide, then we may need to find more evidence. We may need to push China to let international observers to go to Xinjiang to observe and to investigate. So that is, to my understanding, that is the basis of the current call for boycott of Olympiad. But for Canada, it's a little bit more complicated because of 2 Michaels held in China. So that is, something different from the international call for boycott of Olympics. For 2 Michaels and mutual detention of 2 Michaels and the Chinese Meng Wanzhou, that is another story. But if you want to talk about that, further.
Okay, let's shift. Alan, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to wait around till some international jurists decide whether this is strictly speaking genocide or not. There's enough to go on that, a gross violation of human rights. I think that is evident from a lot of reporting, not just by journalists, but academics, etc., of what's going on with the Uyghurs. There's also the destruction of democracy in Hong Kong, the aggression in South China Sea. I mean, there are, and generally the belligerent totalitarian nature of the Chinese regime that I don't see Canadian athletes participating. And the one thing that I find actually quite almost humorous is that the head of the Canadian Olympic Committee, I think Mr. Shoemaker, has said, boycotts don't work. It didn't work in 1980. we should stay part of the conversation with China. And then we find out that this conversation includes training of Canadian athletes to self-censor when they go to China. Don't raise any sensitive issues. So we're going to have a conversation, but it's a one-way conversation where we just approve of of Chinese propaganda. If we're going to go there, maybe if Canadian athletes can wear t-shirts at the the opening ceremony saying stop the discrimination against Uyghurs or stop Uyghur genocide, maybe there will be a point to that, but it ain't going to happen. So once Canadian athletes participate, and I don't see, I understand what you're saying, Margaret, about the opening and clothing ceremonies, but once Canadian athletes are there, they will be playing along with this giant Chinese propaganda show. So I either go or we don't go.
I agree with Alan completely on that, but I think that we have a workable solution. Margaret said there's not enough time, or no countries step forward to move the games. We have enough time. We can move the games to a city that has held the Winter Olympics before. Even our own Vancouver Whistler, we have those former host cities, they have the experience, they already have existing facilities, they have the infrastructure to host the games. So they don't need to start from scratch. So the time for them to get ready is a lot less. And also the potential financial return will be much greater because they already invested those infrastructure. I was in Vancouver when they were building it. And it's building the Canada Line, which is taking the train from the airport in Richmond to downtown hotels. That took the longest time, but that's built. So it is already ready. And if the host new city need more time, IOC can delay the games for a year, just like COVID-19 in Tokyo. Unprecedented situation will require unprecedented creative solution. So we can be flexible. And we have to create very quickly a new way. Say, for example, Canada can step forward and saying that, well, we have a city ready. And if other countries also have a city ready, then IOC can choose. And if no other cities, Canada alone already have the ability to provide a location. So it's absolutely possible to do it. It's just that IOC is trying to delay the timing until it's too late. But in fact, right now it's not too late. It's very doable. And that is a solution that will not actually making the ethnics become a collateral damage. But if IOC refuse to move the games out of Beijing, then we should boycott. And it's a mess that IOC created because they did not listen to people's call for not giving Beijing to host the games. So IOC have the responsibility to solve that problem. And here is a solution. So it has no excuse for IOC not to do it.
All right. Well, Ivy, in terms of moving, and I've heard that a few times, moving to Vancouver took 7 years to build that, to get that ready. And I don't think you could do that in a year, even a year and a half. That's just my thing. Now, I have heard a lot of the stuff in South Korea is still set from the last Winter Olympics, that they possibly could move it. But Margaret, I want to ask you, if hypothetically, if IOC says, you know what, we're moving the games out of China, what kind of reaction, global reaction, are we going to see?
Well, I think in a lot of Western countries, there would be huge support for it. I think it would be fantastic. If the IOC agreed, I don't see that happening, but if they did, if a willing country and city was prepared to step up, in the case of the Beijing Olympics in 2022, it's cost them $7 billion so far to build that and operationalize it. It would cost us at least $3 billion to reconfigure everything for a pandemic context. And remember, it's only less than a year away. So there are a lot of hurdles, but I would say Western countries, at least a dozen, maybe as many as 15 or 20 would be supportive. But we also have all the Belt and Road countries. And China has all of those countries, and it's many in South Africa, Africa, South America, some European countries, all over the world that tend to vote with China on things like this. They tend to vote with China at the UN, which is why we haven't seen China agreeing to an investigation of what's going on with the Uyghurs. I agree with 100% with what everyone has said about the genocide that's happening there. It's horrific. And of course it's a genocide. But China won't let anybody in to investigate. And they know they have the Belt and Road Initiative countries to support them. So I don't see, 100 plus countries lining up to agree to have it moved. And essentially it's the IOC's call, which is really unfortunate.
Kevin,
I actually don't think it's I don't think it's an IOC's call only, because Canadian taxpayers pay a lot of money to fund and train our Olympians. And the Olympians officially represent Canada. So Canadians have a stake and a say, and our government has a responsibility and the ability and the power to actually to act. So it is not just an IOC decision.
Go ahead, Alan.
One thing I think is really interesting, if you look at the top 10 medal winners at the last games in South Korea, of the top 10, all are essentially democracies, with the exception of Russia. And the top 5 are Norway, Germany, Canada, US, Netherlands. Not hard to get all those 5 countries together on a boycott. I mean, we're not talking about, I don't care about the Belt and Road countries, and that maybe within the IOC, that's a reason why you wouldn't get the IOC to do a boycott. I agree with Margaret on that. But in general, the real effectiveness would be, if you got those top 5 countries to say, we're not going, then the Olympics become a bit of a joke. One of the issues with the boycotts back in 1980 and 84 is that there was still a big Olympics in LA, and likewise in Moscow. Moscow could organize something as well. So because the Summer Olympics is really much more of a broader global affair. Winter Olympics is a much smaller event, and sometimes I wonder, in terms of if you moved it, could you relocate, instead of putting everything in Vancouver, have a low-key, decentralized Olympics with some stuff taking place in Korea, some in Norway, some in Canada. I don't know. I mean, maybe, and then the focus would really be on the athletes instead of on the politics.
That'd be a broadcasting logistical nightmare, but it would be. Yes, it would. It would. But
I agree with
understand.
Alan.
Yeah.
I think it's a possible solution. Yeah.
Kevin, I'm wondering, I was reading in the South China Morning Post that Beijing is obviously not happy about talks about a possible boycott, but suggesting sanctions would be applied to countries that decide to boycott. Is that even a legitimate answer from China?
I'm not aware China has threatened to sanction on the countries who are going to boycott Beijing Olympics. So far, I have not got informed of that.
That statement was made on Saturday and was reported yesterday in the New York Times that Beijing has threatened through the Global Times newspaper that what they call there will be fierce retaliation if any country boycotts. So you'd really need to do it with at least a dozen countries rather than singling out 1 or 2.
All right. Well, okay. And this for you, Alan, the number one that is going is the U.S. Joe Biden has already said American athletes are going. So, kind of without that in your back corner, does that?
No, I mean, look, I don't know if any leader, if you asked Mr. Trudeau right now, he'd say Canadian athletes are going. There's been no decision. So I'm not sure what a statement right now means from any political leader. They clearly are not there yet. They may be having some discussions behind the scenes. I still think that this is only going to heat up in the next year. And the other thing is it's interesting about Chinese threats, right? And economic threats. I was just, looking recently about, remember all the terrible threats against Canada to our trade? Canola sales this year are at records, right? Pork sales are at record highs because China needs Canadian products, or those particular Canadian products. So I think we've got to be, keep up our, get some spine, right? And not be intimidated constantly, right?
Right.
And take maybe look at what the Australians, who are much more dependent on China than we are. We have the US right next door in terms of trade, and Australia seems to be not as afraid as we are to stand up to China. And I think that, it's not, the Chinese don't have everything on their side. And they need imports, so that on economics, and we've at one point as a country, we have to stand up for what we believe in. And this is actually, I think, of all the things we can do, the Olympics is a relatively low cost.
Yeah.
It may affect people be very disappointed, Canadians, but I think it comes at a relatively low economic cost.
Margaret, money and sponsors in the Olympics. Now, they wouldn't happen. The games would not happen without deep-pocketed sponsors, but you're not hearing from any of them regarding the Olympics, regarding a possible boycott. You're not hearing anything about that. Is this everybody's just trying to fly under the radar on this one? They just want it to go away and not be sort of implicated?
Yeah, I think that's it. And they're waiting to see, how big this is going to build to. I think Alan makes a really good point about who are the top countries winning medals. And if you took out Norway, the US, Canada, and Russia, well, Russia probably, they're best friends with China these days, so they probably, but some key countries, what you would have as a Winter Olympics that wasn't a real Olympics. And the medals would be devalued because of that, because you would have taken out the top contenders. Norway was the top medal winner last time with 39 medals. The problem with Norway, though, and it's a serious one, they signed an agreement after they gave a Nobel Prize to one of China's greatest writers. Through the Nobel Committee, China trashed the Norwegian salmon sales, and so Norway, in order to get that back, was forced to sign an agreement that it would never compromise Chinese interests. And it's astounding to see the language of this agreement. And so I think Norway would have a really tough time pulling out themselves from something like this, although we know them to be a very principled country.
Ivy, when we look at Canadian athletes possibly going to China, and Alan pointed out about them being sort of schooled on what to say and what not to say. If Western nations go, are they legitimizing the Chinese regime?
Yes, 100%.
Yeah.
Because the reason why China won it so badly, and is because they are doing that for two reasons. One is domestic propaganda, and doesn't matter if you don't, like Margaret said, if you don't attend the opening and the closing, it doesn't matter to the Chinese. they can create a facade because the Chinese people don't have access to real news, whatever the state TV show them. So they can easily manipulate that. If you don't carry the Canadian flag, they can project electronic Canadian flag on their screen easily. They would do things like that. But what they cannot produce is the ethnics. So if you have the ethnics there already, they become the actors. They are actors and actresses, unwilling actors and actresses for their propaganda. And then that's why I say they will strengthen the iron grip on the people, because the people would be fooled again. And then in terms of internationally, the reason they do it is to show their power over the other countries. And then other countries now coming to Beijing to kowtow to them like the emperor in the ancient time, had created that kind of mighty feeling. And then will make them stronger to come back to bully us. And then we might have even more, a few Michaels in their hands. So I think it is a very, very, it's in a national strategic point of view, it's actually a very bad move at this point in time to have our ethnics to go there, because we are helping them and making them stronger. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, I want to thank our panel today. A great conversation on a possible boycott. I have a feeling we'll be talking about this again before the 2022 games do open, wherever they might open. I want to thank our guest joining us on the show, Kevin Kai, Associate Professor, East Asian Studies at Renison College at the University of Waterloo. Ivy Lee is with the Canadian Friends of Hong Kong. Margaret McQuaig Johnson is a senior fellow at the Institute of Science, Society and Policy at the University of Ottawa, along with the Canada-China Forum Advisory Board. And Alan Freeman, senior fellow, University of Ottawa Graduate School of Public and International Affairs. I thank you all for joining us. Coming up on our next Unpublished TV, can artificial intelligence harm or help politics? Should be interesting. Thanks for watching Unpublished TV. Stay safe. I'm Ed Hand.